am from York County, and I am a family member and the co-chair along with Carrie Freeman, who is going to get us started.
Hi, my name is Carrie. I live in Franklin County, and one of the reasons why I felt it was important was this was an opportunity to have a collaboration. I have a collaboration with parents and with our educators, both at administrative levels and teachers, and to really get the community involved in helping to support our individuals. I strongly feel that opportunities for individuals come from all aspects of their life. So an overview of what the local task force is just what I want to cover. It's just a little bit of review of what we did previously. And the biggest thing is that we're only as strong as our membership. And as I mentioned, that this is a collaboration. So we truly are opening it up to everyone, that it is the consumers, which are both the parents and the students. Students are welcome to join us. The intermediate unit executive director or designee, the representative from school districts, the superintendents or special education, anywhere within special education, all are welcome. Directors, supervisors, special education teachers. We are opening it up and have invited the county mental health and intellectual disability and or the autism administrator. And I've invited all three of the ARC representatives. This is open to private citizens and agencies that can help us accomplish the mission of this group, which is to give our individuals a full life. So each local task force provides support to parents and advocates for student rights. So we do offer training for parents, and if we're offering a training or if you need a training, you are welcome to invite others to come and attend. You are welcome to ask us to make a presentation or to help you navigate through something, because we are here to share knowledge of special education, the rules, the regulations, but also to think outside of the box and how we can help with you reach what you need within your community as well. And then together we can succeed. So it's opportunities to engage with others, opportunities to share the updates and the resources. Lisa will be sharing updates from the state on special education. We're allowing families to talk about their challenges. That will not be part of a recording, and exchange their experiences that they are navigating through currently. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions and answer questions, and truly we're looking to build a network of support. This is our contact information. I'll have it on again at the end of our presentation. Lisa introduced herself. I am Carrie. Dr. Murphy also introduced herself. So I am Dr. Murphy. Did you want to go first and talk about the evaluation before Mrs. Manning goes into the annotated IEP?
Sure, I can do that. Thank you very much. And welcome everybody. It's excited to see everybody here. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the evaluation and how that is prepared so that it drives the information to the IEP. So what happens if a PTE or a PT, so the permission to evaluate or permission to reevaluate, there's a request for it, or they happen on a cyclical cycle for students every 2 to 3 years, depending on disability of the child. And what happens in that process typically is information is gathered from all team members. And those team members then get together and discuss what those taken together, the information taken together that describes the needs of the child, the strengths of the child, the areas of focus of the child. And the team determines, what is it that, given all this information, that they may wish to focus on when they generate an IEP. So a child could have many, many strengths, and there could be, again, many, many areas in which the child has non-strengths or has some needs which needs to be addressed. And so the team takes a look at what is the most priority of needs. And I say that plurally, that the team may want to focus on, and then Sorry, I'm also letting people in the room. And then also, are there things in terms of the needs or the non-strengths that need to be addressed in order for the child to be able to provide a fair and appropriate public education, to have access to their education and the learning? Then the team reviews that IEP and determines where and what is appropriate, and a NORA, Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, is offered as well after that IEP team has met. So if you went forwarding to the next slide, so how do we take this information from the evaluation team and turn it into a goal, or turn into other parts of the IEP? So taking a look at what those recommendations are, a goal could be generated. It could be something, an area in which the team feels that should be focused on for education. And so that specifically turns into a goal that's into the IEP. So for instance, if it's an issue that you have a child who is just on the verge or needs to learn those independent bathrooming skills, then you may want to make that a goal to focus on in the IEP, and specifically write that out as a focus of a goal. The information also gathered from the evaluation could be that there are some specifically designed instruction, or there become some things that may be needed to offer to help a student have access to learning that goal, or have access to the education. So for instance, a student who may be lack in some type of attending difficulties may need an area of space that's maybe outlined in an orange square or something, which would be a specially designed instruction, but not necessarily a goal in their IEP. And so therefore it goes into a different section of the IEP, but it is still addressed in that manner. Some recommendations there I have as an example that, if the recommendation is the student needs to check in with a related service provider, your speech and language, your OT, your PT provider once a week, then this type of recommendation would be considered a specially designed instruction and go into that. There may not need to be a goal for such, but maybe they're just on the verge. They just need a little bit of check-in, a little bit of support to make sure that they are holding their pencil correctly, or they're able to sit up on their own, or with the devices that they have. They don't necessarily need the therapy, but maybe they need a check-in with that therapist on a weekly basis. Then that would be specially designed instruction. If the recommendation is a student needs a more targeted support with evidence-based reading curriculum, this could be turned into a goal, such as maybe a specific program, such as Wilson, and then that would be a goal on the IEP. If the recommendation from the evaluation team maybe needs to focus on social skills instruction, then this could be written as part of the specially designed instruction, such as modeling appropriate social behaviors or role playing. It could also be a goal if need be. It all depends on what the IEP team has determined is the priority for addressing that need that has been identified for that student. Any questions? Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to stop screen sharing so Mrs. Manning can start screen sharing. She's going to walk through the annotated IEP, and if you could do a little introduction.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Manning. I am a supervisor of special education in the school district of the city of York. And I was asked to kind of walk through what we call the annotated IEP. And what that basically means is PSAN, which is the Pennsylvania Technical and Teaching and Technical Assistance Network, has put together it's basically a template to guide both staff who might be developing it and parents who may be in need of understanding this document. So I'm going to share my screen and walk through that document. Make sure you can actually see the right screen. So can you see in front of you the IEP? Okay, so I don't know how much experience each of you have with this. So if I go too slowly and I'm redundant, or if I go too quickly, please just let me know and I will either speed up or slow down. But this is basically what the school age document looks like for a student who needs an IEP, Individualized Education Plan. And you'll see a whole lot of verbiage in here, but what this is just language explaining how this should typically be filled out. So the key features on the first cover sheet are really the data from the family, the student's name, the IEP meeting date. It's really important to note here at the team meeting date. So if today would be our team meeting date, October 21st, the implementation date for this IEP would be tomorrow's date, 10/22/20. So the IEP should pick up the day after the meeting immediately. And then the anticipated duration of services is really when is the end date of that IEP? And that would be 1 year from now minus a day. So it would actually be 10/20/21. So you really have like 364 days to really look at this document. But I need to stress up front that just because this has an annual end date does not mean that's the next day you have to look at this. This can be revisited at any given time. Anybody from the IEP team thinks it's necessary. So as a parent, if you feel something in this document is not being implemented correctly, you can call an IEP meeting at any time. So don't be fooled by those dates. So really what this is, is a bunch of verbiage explaining what I just said is the implementation date and all of that. Down here, you go into the date of birth and age of your child. All of this should be filled out when you come together at that table for the meeting. Sometimes the grade is missing, and it depends on the software system that the district is using. Sometimes it doesn't always calculate this stuff properly. So please feel empowered to stop your team and say, the age is wrong or it's missing, the date of their expected graduation is missing. A lot of families feel like they don't have a real voice at these IEP meetings, and I highly encourage you to speak up if you see anything that doesn't look correct on this document. The local education agency is going to be whichever school district or school entity is hosting your child as a student. County of residence, all of your parent information should be listed in there, all those demographics. Couple of key things to note if you're moving. You'll see here there's some yellow highlights there. I pulled the annotated IEP for things that have had a little bit of a change based on COVID-19. There's not a ton of differences between the old IEP and what we're looking at for COVID. But basically, it's still indicating in here in this yellow highlight that even though you may be working virtually, your students might not be face-to-face, an IEP meeting still needs to be held. All the appropriate people need to be invited to that meeting. And the appropriate people in an IEP always consists of the family. The guardian always needs to be invited. A school district administrator who can act as the LEA, a special education teacher, always a general education teacher, and any related service providers if they are part of your child's identified needs. So if speech or OT, anything of that nature is in your child's IEP, they need to be invited. Now, if for some reason any of those team members cannot be at that meeting, the district has to do an attendance waiver for them, and you have to be, as a parent, have to be in agreement that that particular individual can be waived from being in attendance, but they still need to give their written input. And if I'm giving too many details, please let me know. I don't want to insult anybody if you've been through this process a ton of times and I'm giving you too much information. Couple things down here in the annotated piece of this is talking about students who move in from another district or move in from out of state who already have an IEP. So let's say your family just moved to Pennsylvania from, I don't know, Texas, and you're wondering, does my student still get to have special education services? The short answer is yes and no. Yes, that district has to immediately offer your child comparable services based on the IEP that they moved in from. The next step of that is they do have to be reevaluated to determine eligibility in the state of Pennsylvania. So that goes back to that evaluation process that Dr. Murphy was talking about at the beginning of this. But please know, in that interim, while you're going through that evaluation process, the school district is still obligated to be offering your child services until it's determined that they do not qualify. If they do qualify, you'll create a new IEP based on the information that's in that new evaluation report. If they move in from one district to another in Pennsylvania, within the same state, you don't have to go through that reevaluation process. You just pick up where you left off with that IEP. The district can either adopt that IEP in its entirety from the former district, or you can decide as an IEP team to come together as a team and create a new document within that school. Okay, but what the district cannot do, or the school entity cannot do, is deny your child services while they're going through those decision-making process. This section right here is going to look like it's on the cover sheet. This document in front of you looks a lot longer than it typically does because it has all the annotation notes in it. But this next sheet that you see here is date of revisions and participants in that. That's only going to be filled out if you as a team decide to come together to look at this document before the annual date is due. So if you come together as a team and need to revise or modify this document in any way, this section would be filled out. So you would list the date that you met for that revision, all of the people and the roles that were in the meeting, and specifically what section of the IEP that you need to update. So sometimes you might need to go in there and change a goal. You might need to go in there and change present levels, which we'll get to in a minute. But all of these sections should be filled out if you need as a team to revise anything. The other recommendation that is happening right now due to COVID-19 is if there is a need to switch the way teachers are teaching. So if your child is attending now as the hybrid model, they're in school for 2 days, working home remotely 2 days, that needs to be reflected in the IEP. There needs to be justification of the way the delivery of that instruction is occurring. Doesn't mean anything negative. It doesn't mean that your child's not having their needs met, but it needs to be reflected in here how the delivery is occurring. This is just the signature page. Anybody who is attending would sign this. The thing that I stress on this page is that just because you sign this doesn't necessarily mean you are in agreement with the document. It is literally documenting your attendance in the meeting. So don't feel like if you sign off on this that you're agreeing to everything. We'll get to the NORUP at the end, which is where you really agree to what's going on. Members, I already mentioned this a little bit. The members of the team that should be there again are the parents, school district representation, special ed and general education teachers, and any related service provider. You as a parent can invite anybody else that you feel necessary to come to the meeting. So if you feel like you're going into meeting, you're not 100% comfortable with what you think is going to occur, and you feel like you need an advocate, you can invite an advocate to the meeting. Doesn't even have to be a warning. School districts prefer that, but you don't need to warn anybody that you're bringing an advocate or a parent or a friend that you have that you think might be a little bit more savvy in this area and you want them to be there to support you. You can bring them to the meeting and they will be added to that attendance list.
May I add something?
Yes.
Oftentimes I get asked questions about whether or not a regular ed teacher is necessary if the child is 100% special ed. And I usually answer that yes, it is, because it's another set of eyes and there's plenty of curriculum aligned things that we can do in a special ed classroom. Can you speak to that at all, or is that a good answer?
No, that's a fabulous answer. So I'll give a specific example. You have a student who might be in a self-contained emotional support classroom, or perhaps a self-contained autistic support classroom. They see the special education teacher all day long. So they have modified curriculum at times. They're not really out in general education classrooms. But our goal for all of our children is to one day prepare them to be able to participate in that general education classroom and the general education curriculum. So in order to be able to prepare students to do that, we need to make sure that the teacher, the special ed teacher, and the student always has exposure to the general education curriculum. They have some way to interact with it, because we always want to raise that bar. I hate when we put the stereotype on our head, like put the hat of a stereotype saying once a student's in special ed, they're always going to be in special ed. That is not always the case. But if we don't ever give them exposure, then the likelihood of them moving out to that general ed classroom is less likely. So it's important to have that general education teacher to participate so they can share what's going on in the general education room, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It goes right in line with the presuming competence.
Yes, absolutely. We always want to presume competence. We want to not only believe it, but live it, that every child can learn. So in order to do that, we have to give them access to the things that other students have in the building. Now, sometimes the representative for general education might be an art teacher, a music teacher, because those classrooms, a lot of our students in special education are going into those classrooms. They're in that class combined with their general education peers. And I'm also deliberately using the word general education versus regular education, because I think regular education implies that our students in special ed are irregular in some way. So you'll hear those terms used interchangeably, but I really like to stick with general education because I feel like it has less of a stigma to it. So students in special ed will go into the general education classroom with their peers to go into specials or encore classes, depending on what your district calls them. So that teacher's coming in as a representative of, this is the curriculum we know this child can succeed in general ed. So I'm going to come in and show you and talk with you about what your child can do effectively and efficiently in those types of classrooms. So procedural safeguards is a really key part of the IEP process. This is going to be, if you've been in an IEP meeting, you've been offered these, and it has to be offered every single time you have an IEP meeting. It's a thick packet. I think we're up to 28 or 32 pages of that document now. That is all of the rights you have as a parent in regards to your child and their special education services. In that packet, it will explain to you what your rights are, that if you're in disagreement, what your process is for making a complaint or requesting an additional meeting. It will be a huge packet. You don't have to accept it if you do not wish to. If you've had it a few times and you feel like you can wallpaper your house with it at this point, you no longer have to accept it, but it has to be offered. And the teacher or whoever's running that IEP meeting needs to have your signature on there indicating that you were offered that document.
There's an annotated procedural safeguards that I will show people how to get to as well if anybody needs clarification on what it is and what it does.
So then there was another one in here I skipped over, I think, the medical access. Maybe that's later on in the document. Thought it was right here with the procedural safeguards, but this is jumping right down into the special considerations page. So that might come up later, and I'll bring that up again when I come across it. The special consideration page is really the first page where we really start talking about your child and their individual needs or strengths. So in the special considerations page, there's going to be a series of questions that are yes or no. The first one being, is your student blind or visually impaired? And if this is clicked yes, then this document with goals or SDI, specially designed instruction, have to address that consideration, that issue or that concern. So if it's clicked no, you can keep on moving. It's not a concern. So is your child visually impaired or blind? Is your child deaf or hard of hearing? Again, all of this is annotated with notes that you wouldn't normally see in it. This highlight here for COVID-19 is just a reminder that even if your child is has a hearing impairment or is visually blind and they're working remotely from home, the district has to make sure that those services are still appropriately delivered to your child. And if they have any medical fragility, if they are ill easily, they need to make sure specifically in this IEP that the PPE that we use for holding off that virus is in place for your child if they're in person. The next question is, do they have communication needs? Most times this refers to, do they have a need for speech and language services? And if this is clicked yes, we will have a goal or a related service associated with that. COVID-19 note here is if they do have those related services, it might need to be delivered through teletherapy if your child is working remotely at home. These are not things that are normally highlighted in the IEP. Because of COVID-19, we've made some adaptations to it. So the next question is about assistive technology. Do they need assistive technology? And that could be if a student's in an autistic support classroom, they are nonverbal, they need a computer or an iPad or some other type of communication device that will give them a voice. That would be added in here. So that's just one example. And if they're working in that blended or hybrid model, the IEP team, the school district is still responsible for getting those items into the home for them. Does the child have limited English proficiency? And that means, is English their first language? If it is not their first language, do they need English language services to support their learning and to provide them with a free and appropriate public education? And the last question here is, do they exhibit behaviors? Now, this one's really important here. Behaviors that impede their own learning or the learning of others. So this happens a lot for our students who are in emotional support classrooms. They have an identified emotional disturbance of some sort. If this is clicked yes, this child has some difficulty with behavior, then there must be a positive behavior support plan involved for your child. A lot of times I will see IEPs that say, yes, this child has some type of behavioral issue, and then there's no positive behavior plan to support them. So that's a big no-no. So if your child falls into this category and you're not seeing the plan the school has offered to support your child, definitely please speak up. Okay, present levels of academic and functional performance. These are broken down into two sections, starting with academic achievement. This is where I like to tell families and staff, how can we brag about this kid? Like, what do we say positive about this? Let's start out with all of the things this child can do efficiently and proficiently, and then talk about what are the areas of need that they demonstrate. So what are all their academic strengths? It's going to start out with academics. And what are their areas of need? So if they have a specific learning disability in reading, we're going to break down the details of that. And we're going to demonstrate in this section, what is the data that indicates this? So it should have a lot of data in here in terms that you as a parent can understand. Because there's a lot of educational verbiage that gets dropped into these documents. And the average reader doesn't understand it. Unless you work in education, you might not understand what that means. The average reader should be able to pick that up. And when I say average reader, I mean somebody not working in education. They should be able to pick this document and understand. They should be able to picture this child in their head academically. So and your input as a parent will be in here. So I always tell parents, think creatively. This is your time to brag on your child. Tell me all of the strengths that you can identify for your child. And then what are your concerns? What are your goals for your child? How do you feel like the school can support your child to meet their needs as they grow? So that in part's really critical and important. The functional performance, which is still under this section, is really looking at sometimes medical related issues. Do they have a health concern? Do they have behavioral concerns? Is attendance a concern for some reason? Is there something getting in the way of your child being able to attend school on a day-to-day basis? All of that needs to be documented in here so that the team knows how to best support this child. All these yellow highlights are due to COVID, and it's really just saying here, again, about distance learning, making sure that we're taking into consideration all of the needs and the strengths the student would have if they're working from home remotely. And we'll make sure you guys can have access to this document so you can read it in your leisure. It's a lot to take in at once. How's the team going to assess the child while they're working remotely or at home? What is the data that you're going to collect to evidence their growth? Again, this section right here goes into the parental concerns. I've already talked about that. I really encourage you guys to speak your voice during that time. I'm going to summarize this part really quickly because it goes back to strengths and academics. So one of the hardcore things that I say to teachers as they write these is if you have identified from the team's end that there is a need that a student has. So if you say the student struggles in reading and writing, and the student has difficulty paying attention in class, you've identified needs. Anytime there's a bullet with a need, there needs to be a goal associated with it to address it, or a specially designed instruction. You shouldn't be identifying needs that you're not addressing somehow in this document, because the school has a responsibility, the IEP team has a responsibility to meet that child's needs. So if you're bulleting in here that it's a concern or a need for the student, the school needs to be prepared of how they're going to address that. So it usually is a goal, a related service, which will also have a goal, or a specially designed instruction. So a student who has difficulty focusing in class, a specially designed instruction could be the child's seat is in proximity to the teacher, and the teacher is providing visual reminders for the student to remain on task. Or the teacher is giving verbal reminders to remain on task. That's a specially designed instruction. So there always has to be a way the IEP team is going to support that student's area of need. We should not be seeing a list of bulleted needs and no way to address them. Transition services occur when students turn 14. So if they turn 14 at any time during the annual date of this IEP, so the child might be 13 the day that the IEP is written, but they turn 14 4 or 5 months later, transition section must be filled out. There has to be goals and support around transition. And that is a highly encouraged time that the child starts attending their own IEP meetings if they haven't already by that age. At 14, the child needs to be invited to the IEP meeting just like the parents are, just like any of the related service providers. It's when they start understanding their own role in their learning. Hopefully they're learning before that, but at this time we're being more strategic about it. This is all still transition. These are where you put the goals in for transition. It's a separate section than the typical goals are in the IEP. Next section, which is section 4, talks about participation in local and state assessments. There may only be, the state assessments might only be filled out during certain grade levels because the Pssa and Pasa and Keystone are only given at certain grade levels, but this must be addressed in the IEP if the student is going to need any type of modifications or supports during that testing. Local testing is up to the district. So oftentimes kindergarten through 2nd grade who are often left out of state testing, or who are they are left out of state testing because it doesn't start till 3rd grade. Local testing like Acadians, Dibbles, things of that nature that you might have heard of your child taking, the supports that they would need for those assessments would go in this section. It might be small group testing, it might be extended time, it might be directions are read aloud. Those are examples of what might be in that section. This is Pssa and Pasa. The difference between those, if you are not aware, Pssa is the state assessment that all students in 3rd through 8th grade take, including students with IEPs, unless it has been deemed by the IEP team that the student is not cognitively able to take that typical standard test. They may then end up taking the alternative test, which is the Pasa. So that the Pasa test is a lot more hands-on, it's a lot more modified than the state testing. Typically that is our students that are in autistic support, might be in MDS class, students with multiple disabilities. Students with intellectual disabilities may be taking this. Just because you have an intellectual disability does not mean you are taking Pasa. Just because you have autism doesn't mean you have to take the Pasa. You have to look at the individual student and their history with assessments and their ability to learn and take these exams as to whether they'll take the typical test or the alternative test. It's still all about Pssa and Pssa. Down here is the access test. This is the test that students that are second language learners would take if they are in need of this, if they're in need of modifications to the typical English language learner test. So just like the Passa and the Pssa, you would go in and write accommodations for that. Okay. And the really, what I think is the meat and potatoes of an IEP is the goals section. So my student has a disability and they struggle in reading and math. Now what? Well, this is where the now what takes place. It's how we are going to provide instruction specifically for the student. So the goal section should contain just that, a goal. So if a student is in 5th grade and currently functioning on a 3rd grade level for reading, you're going to develop a goal around it on how we are going to close that gap. How can we best help this student move from that 3rd grade level to the 5th grade level? And again, this goes back to why it's important that they're consistently exposed to general education curriculum, because if we do not expose them, that gap just widens over time. So we want them to have access to it so that our goal for them, no pun intended, is to close that gap and get them up on level with their general education peers. So this is the how when you write the goal. The goal needs to be measurable. It needs to be, it needs to have baseline. It needs to show, like, so baseline is where the kid is now. Where do we want to get them there? How are we going to do that? How are we closing that? And how often are we going to be monitoring that goal? All of that should be in this section. Students meet the goal. So when the IEPs are typically written, it's with a year's growth in mind. But if we don't have to wait that year, if we see a student's really struggling and we feel like the goal is too lofty, it's too high, there's no way they're going to meet that goal, we might want to come back and reconvene to adjust that goal. The opposite is true as well. Sometimes students blow right through these goals because the goal was written too low. The expectation wasn't high enough for them and they're blowing right through that goal, and we want to raise the expectation of that goal then. So we might come back as a team and revise that. Short-term objectives. They are only necessary in this IEP if the student is taking the Passa. So if the student has been, if it's been decided that the student's going to take the alternative state assessment, the team has to put short-term objectives in there. And that's just basically the goals written for a year. The short-term objectives is going to break that goal down further so that we see the students meeting the goal through a continuum. So it just breaks it down and chunks it and makes it more manageable for the student and the people working with the student to see success. Gifted, all these same things apply for students with a gifted IEP. Students can actually be dually diagnosed. So they might be gifted in one area and have a learning disability in another. So the IEP might actually have goals for both. A gifted IEP can stand on its own if a student's advanced and they need acceleration. They're still considered exceptional if they have a gifted IQ. So we would treat them in the same way in order to make sure we're meeting their needs, because we want to make sure that they're receiving accelerated support. And that doesn't mean giving them more of the same. You know, this kid finishes something really quickly, so I'm going to give them more of the same. That's not what we want to do with our students who are gifted. We want to make sure that we're challenging their intellect and growing them as much every year as another student would. Down here is the modifications and specially designed instruction section. This is what Dr. Murphy was referring to earlier, and I mentioned briefly as well. This might be some quick things that a student needs, but they might not actually need an entire goal for it. So it might be something as simple as proximity to the teacher. It might mean a modified test. It might mean small group testing. It might mean that a student has reduced classwork. It depends on the student. So you have to be very careful that you're looking very closely at the individual needs of that student to determine what are some supports that the school should be doing. At no time should you see a modification or an SDI that puts the responsibility on the parents. It is what occurs in the school with the kids. So sometimes you might see language in there that, especially now that we're in this remote world, that a parent might have to assist with this or that. Nothing in this document should fall on the responsibility of the family. So I just want to stress that as well. This is the responsibility of the school entity working with your child. And that's also like where the related service, where did that go? The related services section would be on there as well. If they needed speech or OT or PT or a behavioral analyst, it could be a plethora of options. It could be vision support, orientation and mobility. There are a ton of related services that a student may need to be successful and access their curriculum successfully. Try not to, so this is where that section goes. Related service could just as simply be transportation. So if your student is in an emotional support classroom and they don't offer that class in your neighborhood school and they need to go to a school across town, it is the obligation of the school entity to get them there. So transportation may be in there. Or if your child has a physical disability and is in a wheelchair and might need support in that regard, it would be in here as a transportation support. This is again just some language explaining that further, which I'm doing right now. Supports for school personnel. Typically what you will see in here is the general education teacher and the special education teacher or any related service providers will be consulting and collaborating with one another to make sure that they're all on the same page with what's going on with the child, and that they're helping each other help the student, essentially is what that is about. Or what do the teachers need? Do the teachers need ongoing professional development in a certain area? So a teacher new to autistic support might need ongoing professional development in the area of autism. So that would be in here because those supports to the staff are going to ultimately support the student. Okay, extended school year. This is for students who lose their learning or cannot regain it quickly enough after a break. So typically the break we see most often, we focus on is the summer break. So if students come back from the summer and they seem to have lost the knowledge they gained from the school year before, or they can't quickly regain the knowledge and move into the new school year very easily, then we may need to consider if they need services over that break. We typically do not start having those conversations until we've had like a Christmas break so that we can see if students lost that information over the Christmas break. But any students that are in what they call the Armstrong group, which are students with autism, significant emotional disturbance, students with intellectual disabilities, there's certain few categories. The decision has to be made by the end of February of that school year. Not to say you can't come back and revise it later, but a determination needs to be considered by then so that we know for sure the services are going to be in place for the following summer. Most likely extended school year usually occurs for the summer. Doesn't have to, but it usually is. So that's just a little bit more of that. Educational placement. So this is where we start talking about, now we know this student has these needs. We know their strengths. We know what they need to do to close the gap. Where are we going to educate them best? So I'm going to actually go down to the summary of that because that's really the biggest importance. And if anybody wants me to go back up, I can. But this is where your educational placement is going to come into consideration. So does your student only need itinerant services, meaning for the most of the day, they're in the general education classroom. They might need hour support. They might just need some touch in with a learning support teacher, or maybe they only qualify for speech services. So they're going to get speech therapy for 30 minutes a week. That is when we would consider a student might only need an itinerant level services. Supplemental is when they're going to spend a good portion of their day with some type of special education support, whether it's related services, a combination of related services and special education learning support. they may come into the supplemental section. Full-time is for those students that we know for the most part of the day, 80% or more, they're going to be in a special education classroom receiving special education support directly from that special ed teacher. And then we look at, now we know how much time they need. Now we're going to look at what type of support they need. So are they going to need autistic support? Are they going to need some type of blind or visually impaired support, deaf and hard of hearing? As you can see, each of the categories are listed there. Any of those can be itinerant all the way through full-time. And this just goes into a description of what each of those categories is. So you can read those when you have a chance. And then we look at the location of the student's program. So if you're lucky enough, your student's going to your neighborhood school, you would just click yes. But sometimes we click no, because like the example I already gave, if a student, it needs to be an emotional support classroom and they don't offer that in the school that's closest to you, he or she might need to be bused to another school, of which case, no, it's not their home school, their neighborhood school. So we would need to explain why. And then indicate where they were going to go. Down here is the Penn data sheet. This is for the calculation of how many hours or minutes of support they would receive. And that's the annotated IEP in a nutshell, in a very long-winded nutshell. I don't know.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Does anybody have any questions? I have the NORUP I can share as well.
One of the questions that I get often is if a parent needs training, where does that get recorded within the IEP?
Ooh, great question. So let me pull that back up. It's right near the area of the school personnel. And we don't really ask that question often. And again, I think it goes back to the parents not feeling as though they have a voice.
Okay, please leave.
So again, I encourage you as families to use your voice and speak up. Don't be fearful, because you have rights, and those are all outlined in those procedural safeguards. So if you feel as though you need an educational background, like you need some supports or tips on how to work with your child with autism, the school district will be responsible for providing some of that parent support. And it can be documented in here in the IEP that you need that. And it's around that same section, and now I can't find it, for the school personnel and related services.
Thank you very much for covering that.
Yes, absolutely. And in all of my years in education, I've never had a parent ask me that. I have said to parents, like, I think you might benefit from this, but I don't think it occurs to them that it could be a possibility.
Does anyone else have any questions, or would you like to wait till the recording's over to ask questions?
Yeah, and I'm going to stick around in case you have questions later. I'll show
Okay.
you the NORUP real quickly, if you don't mind, Carrie. Like, I have that pulled up too, because the NORUP is going to be where you actually sign permission. Earlier, I told you when you sign on the IEP, you're just signing attendance. You need to actually give your permission for all of this to happen. They can't place, we as a district cannot place your child in any special education classroom unless we have your permission to do so. So this is the NORUP, the Notice of Recommended Education Placement. In here, the first question you will see is, what type of action are you proposing? And this NORUP, or a prior written notice, can be used for a multitude of things. It could be the district initiates it for some reason. So a parent might request testing, and the district might say, no, now's not an appropriate time to evaluate this child. I can give you an example, a specific one that I'm going to be writing a NORUP for this week. A student who is in kindergarten, who is working virtually, who has never been to school before. The parent is asking for an evaluation for special education services. We can, if we would do that evaluation right now, we have absolutely no way of knowing if the student's struggles on that evaluation are due to a true disability, or the fact that they've never been introduced to education before. We have no data to support that, to support that. They're not currently in school to demonstrate a need. It's a parent reported concern, which we have a high regard for parent input. But in a situation where the student's never been introduced to school, it's really hard to rule out or rule in a disability when we have that issue. So I might use this document to say, I am not going to refusal to initiate an evaluation, which is the second box. Sometimes we think
And to your point, also the evaluations that are being accepted, we are not allowed to change the format in which they are designed to be given. So there is no precedent for evaluations that are of gold standard to be conducted virtually. There are very few evaluations that can actually be done that way, and they are not considered gold standard evaluations. So that is something that we really have to be mindful of, what we're asking for and what evaluations we're using.
Thank you for that point, because it is a whole new world living virtually. Now in York City, what we're doing, because we do have our special education students with complex needs in the buildings face to face, even though the rest of the population is working virtually right now. So if we feel as there's a valid reason to move forward with an evaluation for a student for whatever reason, we're requesting that family to bring the child in person to do those evaluations. We are not comfortable doing them virtually for the reasons Carrie was just mentioning. It's not standardized correctly for it to be virtually. So we are requesting them to bring them in or to pause the evaluation until the point where the family feels comfortable bringing them in, because we're certainly not going to mandate somebody who feels unsafe in a building to come in. But we are trying to ask them to pause that until they're safely able to return to the building. But this, like I said, the NORP has multiple purposes. So it could be to document that the team is recommending itinerant learning support services. So in that case, and it's the first time we've evaluated the student, the first box will be checked. So this is proposing initial provision of special education services. And then we would go down and explain where we got the data, what our proposal is, itinerant learning support, why we feel that that's an appropriate placement. And we would talk about the evaluation process and the data that was collected. What are our options considered here? We might have said, okay, we did this evaluation, the student has a learning disability. We considered full-time learning support. That's not appropriate because it's not necessary for this particular student to be in a full-time classroom all day. So they would actually miss out the general education curriculum and supports. A student who is dually diagnosed, so to speak. So if a student might have a specific learning disability and an emotional disturbance, we might consider emotional support services, but we're going to say, well, we're rejecting that for right now because we believe the bigger hurdle is the learning disability. And if we provide this child with supports and services around the learning disability, it's going to diminish the behaviors that we're seeing. So we don't want to put them in an emotional support classroom yet. This can be used as a placement recommendation for a student, or like I was saying back here, these are the other things. Student might exit special ed and we celebrate when that happens. So we might be creating a NORUP to indicate that the child has successfully met all of their goals. They have the strategies and the supports needed to make them successful now in the general education classroom. They don't need supports in special ed anymore. So we'll click that. Student might be graduating, so they're exiting high school. This NORUP might be because we have decided that the student doesn't regain those skills after their summer break. So now we're going to recommend ESY or extended school year. So this might be a documentation for that. So this really documents a lot of different supports and needs. When you sign this document, well, let me show you the options, because just because you signed it doesn't mean you're agreeing. Here are the options for when you do sign this. And for some reason, it's the second box that says agreement. I always think it should be the first one, but it's the second box. I agree and approve the recommendations in this document. But if you're not quite comfortable with that, you might click the first box saying, I request another meeting. I need some I need some more information. I'm not quite understanding what's going on right now. I would like another meeting to discuss this. You would check that first box. The last box here is, I do not approve this right now. I know what you're talking about. I'm not in agreement. And if you click that, you then would want to click one of these other two options in addition. So mediation, which means an outside person not related to you or the district would come in and mediate an understanding to come to some kind of common ground. Or you feel like all of your rights are being violated, or some of your rights are being violated, and you want to go straight to a due process hearing. Word of advice though, just because you click due process hearing doesn't mean it automatically will go to that. You do have to follow up with an additional letter and paperwork for that. So read your procedural safeguards very closely if you at all feel uncomfortable with what's going on with your child, because that's going to help you make a decision here. So if you approve this action and then you sign here and date it, the services will then start for your child that were recommended in that IEP.
One of the other things, if you'll scroll back up, is the 10 days. So failure to respond and failure to sign it is approval, just so you're aware. And you don't have, if you check that I do not approve, you are allowed to write your reason and not check mediation and due process, and just very clearly state your reason. Because if you don't feel that another meeting, give it an opportunity, have your concerns expressed clearly, and wait and give them a bit of a chance to respond is always an option before you click mediation or due process, because it seems to lock you in.
Yeah. So that's a good note for an IEP that you have already had in place. So let's say this was your annual IEP, your child's already been in services. If you don't click yes, like Carrie said, after 10 days, we assume that you're in agreement if you don't send this back or you don't sign anything. But if it's the initial provision of services, they've never received services before, correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, if they've never received services before, we can't assume you're in agreement with that. We would have to continue to follow up with that. So that's when that 10-day rule doesn't apply, is if they've never been in services before. And also another point to go back to what Carrie was saying, if you have, say you've done a reevaluation with your child, a new IEP was written and you don't agree, you're going to check no here. You go into a hold in which the old IEP stays into implementation until a new agreed upon IEP comes in place. So you would work from the old IEP until further notice, until there's some type of resolution to your concerns with the new one. So I just wanted to point out those couple of things. I know I work in a district and I speak on the district's behalf, but I'm a huge advocate for families. So I want to make sure families understand their rights, and that everybody should be coming to the table for the purpose of the child. So if at all you feel like it's you against them, I highly encourage you to reach out to somebody else for support to bring to your meetings to advocate on your behalf. Because it should never be us against them or you against the school district. You should be there for the right reasons altogether for your child.
Great job, Mary. Thank you so much for the detailed information and updates for.
Yes, very much. Thank you, Mary. These were some of the resources that Mary was using, the Annotated Iep. Then understanding your procedural safeguards can also be found. We can make these links available. She covered the annotated prior written notice, and this does hit on the initial evaluation and request. And then there is an annotated positive behavioral support plan, which we did not go over, but it is available for your review. The website that we use, or I use most often for resources, is PTAN, Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. And this is what the site looks like when you're going to look for the annotated individual education plan. And this gives you the guidance with COVID. So some of the suggestions from a parent standpoint before you're getting ready to go into an IEP is to review the invite. get familiar and look at who's on the invite. Are the people that you would like to see part of your child's team invited to the IEP? And then take a chance to look over some of the IDA and the state regulations. Try and familiarize yourself with the vocabulary. But as Mrs. Manning said, we really are looking for an IEP that has terminology that anyone can walk away and read. One of the things that is the most impactful when you sit in front of an IEP team is to have a vision for your loved one. Have an idea of what it is that you envision for your child's life. And it could be just for that year. It could be just for that marking period. Or when we hit that transition age, it could be going into what it might look like career and career readiness. But just having that vision really helps the team come together to have an idea of who your child is and what it is that you're looking for their life and what their interests are. Read the procedural safeguards so that you do know what your rights are. If you have already had an IEP in place, it's a great idea to take a moment and look at that progress data, the communication logs and the schoolwork, any type of information you might have about the behavior to make sure that in the present levels that is addressed. And if it's addressed as a need by the team, moving forward, is there an SDI in place? Is it possibly addressed in a goal? Or could it possibly be addressed in the positive behavioral support plan? And then the most recent school evaluation gives you a lot of information. So if there are things that are showing up as some areas of concern, make sure that you're looking at those. And just because things show up as an area of concern, they don't always have to be something that you're addressing right now. They could be something that you are putting off just a little bit for more pressing goals and more pressing areas of need. Yes, should we keep those in mind? Always. But sometimes we need to prioritize. And as we prioritize and we address larger things, sometimes the smaller things do click with some help with specially designed instruction. And then if there was a draft, are they shared with you? And then take time to write your parental concerns in advance. I usually take an opportunity to write parental concerns, and those are an exchange of emails, because I'm not sharing or not doing my final parental concern until after we've met and we've gone through the IEP, because some of the things that we've said in emails back and forth, those might have already been incorporated into the IEP and they are no longer remain parental concerns. Prioritizing a collaborative mindset, knowing that you're a part of a team because your voice matters, and ensuring that everybody on the team is working together because everybody's there for the student. Being concise. Our teachers do value each and every child that is in their classroom and that they are taking care of. It would be best if we could just keep our information concise. One of the best ways to do that is to bullet point that information so that we can clearly communicate what it is that we want. Sometimes I find myself writing a paragraph, but my paragraph still leaves the question of what do I want? So making that bullet point actually says, this is what I would like to see for my child. Try and keep emotion out of it. It is so difficult, even for myself, who have helped many parents advocate when it comes to my own children. That emotion always creeps in. And whenever possible, really focus on that data. I realize that our students are individuals and they are loved and they are cared for. That progress monitoring and the data and the IEP goals really are driven by what is on that progress report, what is on the evaluation. All of this drives the ability for us to create goals. And if we're not able to create IEP goals, other things ends up in the specially designed instruction to help support our children. When we're working with a group of people and our main access to them tends to be emails, sometimes it's a text. It's rarely over the phone or it's rarely in person. So just be careful when you assume intent. So try and just focus on the facts of the message that you're receiving, because most of the time it isn't meant in a negative manner. So if you can truly just look at what is sent to you versus assuming intent, relationships would really be benefited that way. And then when you're able to use the IDA language and you're able to recite your state regulations, and you're able to understand the vocabularies, some of the exchanges in the IEP can become more meaningful. And we here at the local task force are willing to do some of the training. So if you need help, reach out to us, and Lisa and myself and Dr. Murphy are more than happy to try and help make sure that you have the vocabulary you need to speak for your student. I pretty much covered this. So this is something that is, I'll just cover one more time. What is your student reporting to you about school? So not all children are verbal. This could be in the way they're behaving. Are they getting ready for school? Besides, outside of the normal teenagers not exactly wanting to go to school on time, but if your child is fighting you every morning, is there a reason? So behavior does speak. When they come home from school, checking in with them. What is working and what is not working is huge in your parental concerns, because you know your child and you can try and get a feel for what makes them feel different, what makes them feel successful. And then addressing both your academic concerns, your behavior concerns, and as we mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier, making sure that you have that loved one's vision and the IEP reflecting what that vision is. Presuming competence. I love the way Mrs. Manning spoke to this. This is exactly my feel for this is the more access our individuals can get with general education, the better, the more curriculum aligned standards that we can introduce to our kids, just we'll see so much of a difference for our children. And when we presume competence and we get that general education, we get that inclusion that we're looking for. And then, are there food and medical concerns? And have any of the areas of needs not been addressed? And if you're requesting an evaluation, that might be something that you should share with the IEP team in advance. At the conclusion of the IEP team, as Mrs. Manning said, when you sign in the attendance, it's that you are there. Before you sign the NORREP, you're not required to sign it there. You can take the time to bring that IEP paperwork home. Or if it's not being sent home with you right away, you'll ask when you'll get the copy of the IEP. Have a chance to look it over, have a chance to review it, make sure that the things that you discussed in the meeting are included. Hopefully a note taker was provided, because it's very hard as a parent to be participating within the IEP and to be taking notes at the same time. It's challenging. So if you want to bring a note taker with you, great. Usually one of the IEP team members of the staff usually volunteers to take the notes, and getting a copy of those before you leave is a very good idea. And if you were provided with the NORREP, check the date and keep that 10 days in mind.
Carrie, can I jump in real quick? Because you
Sure.
reminded me of something I forgot to mention when I was talking in regard to the copy of the IEP. You should be provided that IEP prior to your IEP meeting. So not just at the meeting and take it home and review it. You should have had an opportunity to preview it before your child's meeting is scheduled. So just be cognizant of that, because it helps you have a better understanding. And that is only a draft. Some districts will draft it while you're in the meeting, but most districts will draft it prior so that you have a document to look at when you come in together. But please note that just because you get it in advance does not mean that's written in stone. It's draft.
Thank you. And then these are more resources that we'll make available again, because I believe you'll be getting a copy of the PowerPoint, or it will become available on the local task force website. And Lisa?
Yes, ma'am.
Whoops.
Here are some additional tips. That's fine, Carrie. You can go ahead to the next slide. And just sharing some additional tips with you and thinking about those with complex needs, and particularly because in my daily work with families that have complex needs, mental health, additional social and emotional behavioral needs, these are some additional things to think about along the way. And so routines and boundaries are highly important. And just remember setting, particularly in the virtual setting that a lot of us are working with now, maintaining some sort of routine or developing and maintaining a routine is you will find will become your best friend along the way, particularly because our kids aren't going to school in some cases, which would really set them up to be successful at home and having the routines, and then providing boundaries and what are you willing to accept and what are you willing to allow some extra space and time with. And particularly working from home, it can be difficult trying to support children at home virtually with routines and with boundaries, because they're in they're at home and they're comfortable, and so sometimes they may not necessarily want to remain online to complete assignments or do additional homework or meet their teacher online at a certain time. And so just remembering to start that process early and prepare them. And then start each day afresh and anew. And so if you're going through the day and one or however many your children have challenges that day, or you just have a difficult day, just try to remember that, starting each day afresh and anew makes for better experiences, not only for you as the adult and parent, but also for the youth that you're working with as well. Next slide, Carrie, please. Thank you. And this was mentioned by both Carrie and Mrs. Manning a couple of times about just checking in. And you just want to make sure that you're checking in sometimes with your students, particularly around meeting the needs of an IEP or meeting any other additional goals for other plans and services that your children may have. So it's important to check in to make sure there's understanding, to make sure that they don't have any questions or additional guidance isn't needed. And also for yourself, checking in with yourself and staying in tune as the parents really helps you set the tone for your children. So that check-in piece doesn't have to be anything detailed and heavy and lengthy. It's just really checking in and saying, hey, how you doing? Have any problems? Sometimes it's just looking over their shoulder and affirming for yourself that they've actually are doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, and also aren't really having any questions. So checking in is highly important. Communication, and this can be a tough one, and it's been mentioned a couple of different times, but having open communication within your family, between yourself and the youth you may be working with, but also with your team. And everyone on the team should be on the same page and have the same understanding. So does everyone have the same information? Are we all coming together and working from the same frame of reference? Or do you have one or two folks on the team that may not necessarily have all of the needed information to make the best decisions or to be able to best serve your child? So making sure that everyone is on has the same information and is on the same page. We talked a little bit about sharing strengths and opportunities, and this is one that I always will talk particularly with parents about, because sometimes as we are dealing with youth with challenges, no matter what the diagnosis, sometimes for some of us, we are living crisis to crisis. And in all honesty, when you are dealing in crises, sometimes the strengths are the first things to go, meaning that as the parent, those are the first things that we tend to forget that our children have. And so when we're being asked about strengths, we want to make sure that we can articulate a couple of those strengths that our children have, because everyone has them, regardless of circumstance. Everyone has strengths. So just important to remember to at least tuck 2 or 3 of those strengths in the back of your mind to hang on to, so that when those times get rough, you'll be able to still remember the strengths of those childs. Communicate the lessons learned for the child, the lessons learned for you as the parent, and share those with the team. That's important for everyone to know, and because the process is successful when the team works together. And if you find something that works as a parent, share that with the team, and maybe they can implement that within the school setting as well. So it's important to communicate. What does your child feel and think? And again, that checking in piece and allowing them to have a voice. And they may not necessarily completely understand the process 100%, but they will be able to tell you how they're feeling about what they're doing and what they think. And they may even have suggestions that could be implemented as well. So it's important to check in with them. And then let others know when things are going wrong. And it's important to know that when you are trying to complete goals of an IEP or any other plan, family service plan, several other plans that are out there based on services, you may be struggling to obtain one or more of those goals. And so you want to make sure you communicate that. And when there is situations or struggles that come up, when you share that with the team, you're able to collaborate and also have communication between everyone to maybe discern whether we need to change that goal, that's fine, thank you. No, go ahead. Whether we need to change the goal or not. So it's just important to understand what to do when those things go wrong. And when you are identifying goals for your IEP or a 504 plan, just some basic things to be thinking about as well along the way. And it's, do you and your child understand the goals? And sometimes, Mrs. Manning talked about having an advocate or someone go along with you to support you in a meeting that may be a little bit more informed about the IEP process, or about utilizing their voice, and will be able to help you to better understand what the process is like, but making sure that you understand what is being asked within the goals, to make sure the child understands what's being asked within the goals. And then are those goals truly achievable? And sometimes, asking those questions are really important. And I know Mrs. Manning mentioned about setting goals that may not be maybe too easy, but you also want to make sure that the goals aren't too hard as well, because you're looking for goals that are attainable and reachable, and pushes them a little bit, but not frustrate them. That's not the place that you want to go. You want to make sure that those goals are pushing them and checking their boundaries of growth, but also something that's within reason, so that you can set them up for the small wins. And it's important that children recognize that they are winning, and that's the process. And sometimes they're not able to see that, and we, as the big people in the room, can recognize whether there's growth and whether there's been success. But we want to ensure that our youth are able to see that there are some wins in the process as well, and that helps with forward motion. Continuing to identify future goals from your perspective as the parent. And this is where, and it has been said a number of times throughout the presentations, where we as parents really play a huge role in this process of developing the plan for our children. So making sure that your voice is heard, and making sure that you're thinking ahead always as well around what those potential goals for the future will look like. And then consider short and long-term goals. And sometimes those goals where I'm talking about here may not necessarily be reflected within the IEP, but these may be personal goals that you have as well, as the parents, that you really want to ensure that is worked on, and could be potentially included in the IEP process as well. This is something that sometimes we as parents tend to forget, and it's just looking out and paying attention to the little things. Notice the differences in the changes, and sometimes it's in actions, sometimes it's in abilities, sometimes it's in personality traits, but just paying attention, being more aware of differences and changes, so that you're able to adapt if necessary, and provide those tools necessary to the youth to continue to be successful. And then documenting what you see. And the word document will be your best friend if you just remember to note, and grab a journal, grab a notebook, where you're keeping notes and making documentation of what the experiences are, differences, changes, improvements, things that you can share with the team. Also some comments that your children may be sharing. And it could also be from direct conversations that you're having with them about something, or it could simply be things that they're sharing with you that you want to note to make sure to share back with the team when you meet up again. And then you're deciding what information should be shared with the doctor or with the team. And that's important because, again, going back to everyone being on the same page and having the same understanding and working with the same information. It's important that we share that information with the team. And then what mental notes should you make for yourself? What are the things that you need to recognize for yourself? What are the things that you may need to learn for yourself? Because as Mrs. Manning mentioned, there's a process, there's a place in the IEPs for families to be able to address their particular needs. But what notes do you want to make to ensure that you have what you need as the parent to be able to provide what's the best direction for your children? And then looking at, again, more complex needs and continuing to monitor other concerns and needs that you may see that are coming up that may not necessarily be reflected within the IEP, but maybe concerns that you may want to address with other team members, or maybe it's with a doctor or a therapist, but you just want to have an opportunity in your taking of notes to pay attention to any other concerns or needs that may come up along the way. And again, if appropriate, share with your team as well. Do what you have. Do you have what you need to be successful? And this is one of those keys as well. When you are, developing the IEP and the goals within the IEP, and if there are things that you can do in the home setting to support what's going on at school, you're not necessarily required to, because as mentioned earlier as well, all of those things in the IEP are what the school should be providing. But what are some things that you as parents at home could be doing that to help the process along the way for them to be successful? Do you have other team members that are involved from other systems that may not necessarily be at the table? There's a place to share that as well within your IEP, because you do want all players to know who's actually touching your children, who's working with them, who's providing services, and what are the additional needs that may be needed, and at what point do we need to discharge for any one of those particular services as well. And then continue to keep your communication open as best you can. Frustration will set in occasionally, but make sure that you are using your team as a resource. And if you're getting frustrated and with trying to work with your child at home, which you're trying to provide support, or your child is telling you they're having some struggles in the school setting, you want to document that and continue to share that with your team as well. And then here's the big one, asking for help. And sometimes we struggle as individuals in doing so. But when confused, when you're overwhelmed, which is really, really easy to do on this journey that we're all on and trying to manage and cope with all that is in front of us and dealing with daily challenges. Education can be difficult and a challenge for the typical person. And so when you're adding challenges or additional services and support, sometimes it does become overwhelming and you can be confused. So please feel free to ask questions at any given time. Your team is here to support you and work with you, and also allow your children to ask for help as well. Give them the permission to be able to ask for help. Any questions around the tips that either Carrie shared or I shared before we jump right into the couple of state updates? Hearing none. Carrie, if you would shift back to the state updates, I'll go through and share the state task force updates from our last meeting. You can flip the slide. So, and these are just some high level highlights of our last state meeting around some of the things that were shared within the meeting. And a lot of it talked about extended school year servicing, which Mrs. Manning talked about as well, and just related to COVID and how COVID can and has changed some things that are being done for schools and for families related to IEPs. So Mrs. Manning talked about gaps due to COVID and when testing would occur in your school setting and what to do when that testing has occurred. And when you determine that there are gaps, then the school and district will determine whether those gaps are the typical gaps that could potentially occur during breaks, or are they truly due to COVID, the shift in education the past several months that we've had with COVID? So it's important to know to differentiate the different types of gaps that could be occurring with students. If they have met their gains, then they would not necessarily need recoupment services. And if not, then if they haven't met those needs, then you require a new team meeting to determine how to regain those losses. And a couple of these points have to do with questions that were asked that I felt that I would like to share some of the responses that oh good heavens, I forgot her name, that the special ed director was sharing. And so someone asked a question related to PCAs with virtual settings. And so it was shared that if you do have PCAs in your IEP, written into your IEP, they were recommending, the state is recommending that the team determine the needs based on the need, and if there's a necessity for that, if there continues to be a need, a necessity for a PCA, particularly if you're in a district that is doing a hybrid or all virtual setting. And if the answer is yes, under IDA, services should be provided, but consideration to health and safety is of the highest priority, and that's what they really want us to take away and think about how and what that would look like, and determine what's reasonable and feasible as it relates to fulfilling the need for a PCA. Next slide, please. Someone asked a question about what happens if a hearing officer has provided some guidelines for compliance in a specific situation for school districts, and the school district was not being compliant with any of the orders from the hearing officer. And so they shared that you could file a concern with the Bureau, as they have liaisons available to connect families and schools to be able to ensure that those orders are being filed. And so there's a process for that, and that is available also on the patent website that Carrie mentioned earlier. And then also, I think the last meeting and this meeting, we talked a little bit about there are grants available for districts around extended school year. And the CARES Act provided $10 million to the state, and the Bureau is adding $5 million to that, and really to look at two particular pieces, and that's for districts to either start implementing services for extended school year, or to enhance remote learning services for those that are having synchronous learning. So I think a lot of our districts are really taking advantage of that based on the needs of any particular district. And then there were a couple of House bills that were mentioned as well, really looking at offering an extended school year to every student with an IEP this summer. And I'm anxious to hear about whether that's going to pass or not, or at least at this point, I haven't heard one way or the other, but it has been proposed to offer extended school year to every student with an IEP. And then there's also some legislation around school vouchers. There wasn't much detail given with that, but there was some information around school vouchers coming up as well. And that ends our presentation. Here's our contact information again. And myself, I'm Lisa, and then Carrie is the other co-chair for our task force. And then Dr. Murphy is the one who spoke first, who'd opened this up. And so we just want to thank you for being with us today and take any questions at this point in time. I guess we'll stop recording.